Grab your beverages and turn up your interweb. Solving the world's problems 12 ounces at a time. It's Dudes and Beer. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this special 420 edition of the Dudes and Beer podcast. I am Chris Jordan, your host. Our guest tonight, I cannot wait to get into this again. My wife and I had a rousing discussion about it just a little while ago, before coming in to record this and do all this. Katherine Chiljan, with Shakespeare Suppressed, author of the book Shakespeare Suppressed, as well as fellow at the Shakespeare-Oxford Fellowship. We will be talking about the idea that the works of Shakespeare were not necessarily penned by, quote, Avon man, as they put it, the man from Stratford-upon-Avon, but rather quite likely Edward de Vere's. Or another member of the English court. Some say Francis Bacon. There's, of course, the concept of Christopher Marlowe. We're going to be getting into some of that this evening. All kinds of fun stuff. I am really going to try to step back as much as possible and let her take the lead on this, because this is actually, by the way, in 3 days, happy birthday and death day to at least Avon man, the man that we know as Shakespeare. So a birthday, death day episode at the same time. Please do remember, before we get started with all the fun today, folks, stop on by dudesandbeer.com. That is where you can get the all-new app. dudesandbeer.com/app is the link. It's also right there on the homepage. All you got to do is hop on over, visit that page, and whenever you do, you will see the groovy Dudes and Beer app link right there. All you got to do, it is not on any stores, by the way. It's not on the Android store. It's not on iTunes. Right now, I'm trying to get an iPhone version coded. I've got the code. I just need to have it turned from binary into their version. But APK right there. All you got to do is click OK, and it'll save to your device. You open it up, and you got Dudes and Beer live right there in your pocket. You can listen to all of our stuff live. You can chat in questions. You can carry on conversations. There's a tip calculator. All kinds of great stuff right there at dudesandbeer.com. While you're on there, see that groovy little tile down here, where it leads you to True Hemp Science inside of our sponsors section? Stop on by. Check out True Hemp Science. Speaking of 420, they are the makers of some of the best darn CBD around, folks. I am here to tell you, I have used CBD from all over this great nation, and True Hemp Science is some of the best that I have personally ever used. Stop on by truehempscience.com today. I've got a bottle of there. My favorite thing is that they use full emulsification process. So, and whole plant. That's the other thing. It's not just bud. It's not just leaf. It's not just stem. It is the whole plant. So you're getting a full spectrum of the benefits from the plant itself. And they also use Ayurvedic herbs, like in this mix right here. They're H2O based. Fantastic. Stop on by True Hemp Science today. truehempscience.com is the website that you want to go to. Dudes7 is the code that you want to use to save 7% off your entire purchase of $50 or more, and at the same time get 50 milligrams. That's right, 50 milligrams of cookies or brownies. So stop on by truehempscience.com today. Fantastic stuff. And honestly, while we are being truly shameless, let's go ahead and break into podcastcadet.com. Have you considered starting a podcast? Looking for a way to make your business a voice of authority in an industry? Then Podcast Cadet is the solution for you. Whether starting a podcast for yourself, your brand, business, school, church, or just plain fun, Podcast Cadet is here to help you navigate the waters of the podcast industry. Specializing in one-on-one consultation and training with industry professionals in fields ranging from podcast technology and editing to distribution, monetization, and even social media strategies. Podcast Cadet tailors their services to the specific needs of you and your podcast. Do you already have a podcast and trying to find ways to engage and grow your audience? Sign up for your Podcast Cadet audit today and let us help you explore new and exciting ways to leverage your content and elevate your podcast brand to whole new levels. From consultational workshops to affordable podcast production and maintenance packages, Podcast Cadet is your one-stop shop for everything podcast related on the internet. Visit podcastcadet.com today to sign up for your consultation or training and use code DUDES20 to save 20% off your entire purchase. That website again is podcastcadet.com. Hey, podcastcadet.com today. That is the website where you can, if you're trying to start up a podcast for yourself, friends, family, fun, church, school, business, whatever. That's all we do over there is podcasting, distribution, teaching people how to do it. We also help out with PR, all that kind of stuff. So stop on by podcastcadet.com. Our guest today, I am so entirely excited to have back on. She is the author of the amazing book, Shakespeare Suppressed. Katherine Chiljan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. So good to be here again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to come back on the show. I'm always so glad whenever guests come back for a second appearance and more. Because it makes me know that people enjoyed their experience, and that they got something out of it. B, it's the fact that we really, really get to dig deeper into topics. And that's where the real fun comes about. Like today, being able to get into some of the Christopher Marlowe stuff, Francis Bacon, that kind of thing. It's mind blowing to me. The fact that who we know as Shakespeare may not necessarily be so. So before we get any deeper, let's go ahead and familiarize some of the new listeners with the concept of the Shakespeare authorship controversy and everything that you guys are about over at the Shakespeare Fellowship.
Yes. Well, we're talking about a 170-year-old controversy that never seems to go away because there is no lifetime evidence that the great author was the man born in Stratford-on-Avon, and that's the place where, at least before COVID, thousands and millions of tourists have gone, that little town north of London, to visit the birthplace of the great author. But there's no evidence that that person was actually the writer. And so if you divide it between lifetime evidence and after he died evidence, everything is located in the after he died evidence, the posthumous evidence. And so that is irregular. When you look at the lives of other authors like John Lilly and Edmund Spenser and many other writers of the period, we for the most part know where they were educated. We have letters that have survived. We even, in some cases, like Ben Jonson, we have a manuscript of his that has survived. But nothing has survived for the great author, William Shakespeare. In fact, I ask people all the time, when I tell them about this, I say, tell me, what do you know about William Shakespeare? And they'll kind of, shake their head a little bit, and then they'll say, he was an actor. Or they might say, he was born in Stratford, and that's pretty much about what they know about him. But it turns out there really isn't that much more known about him. if you really look at the documentary evidence. I mean, we have things that we have his christening, we have his children's christening, we have his marriage, not document, but a notation of his marriage. We have various lawsuits that he was involved in. You know, we have payments for taxes, things like that. But, I mean, these are things that are just could apply to anyone during the period, right? We do, however, have a document that says that he was a member of the King's Men Acting Company. That was in 1603. So that one, I'm not going to dispute that. And also that he owned theater shares. But being an actor and owning theater shares doesn't mean you're a writer. So it means that you have to say, okay, there could only be one person named William Shakespeare during this period, and hey, here is that one person, and hey, he was involved in the theater. So, you know, therefore, he is the great author. But, you know, there's a lot more to that. And in fact, there were other people named William Shakespeare during this period. I noted in my book, in 1605, there was a William Shakespeare in the same county as the Stratford man, Warwickshire County, who was listed as a soldier. And we do know that this could not be the author because at that time he was signed up for the King's Men Acting Company. So this is where, you know, if you look closer, the argument starts to break down. And what it turns out to be, you know, when all of these kind of missing things about the Stratford man. We don't have any sign of his education. We don't have any manuscripts that have survived letters. It's all a big zero. No payments to him as an author. You add all the cumulative evidence, and it appears that the name was a pen name. You're not going to find an author, Shakespeare, who went to university. You're not going to see the name William Shakespeare in the records. You're not going to see William Shakespeare, talking, somebody relating about him in a letter. It's not going to be the name William Shakespeare. It's going to be another name. Yeah. William Shakespeare was his pen name in the sense of shaking a spear, a descriptive action. And we know this because many of the references to Shakespeare that were printed, when we're talking about the author, had a hyphen between shake and spear. And it wasn't because the second part of the word was going to the next line. It was all in one line. So that back then was an indication of a made-up name, a descriptive name. So also, if you look further at what contemporaries were writing about William Shakespeare, they were talking about a whole different man, and I have a whole chapter on that in Shakespeare Suppressed. They were describing him as someone of high rank, that he wrote anonymously, that he wrote as a hobby, that he was well known to university students, things like that. Now, of course, these are not, although they're printed, they're not openly saying that. You kind of have to read them, and understand the meaning. Sometimes they threw in classical allusions, like, just to give you an idea, one person called William Shakespeare our English Terence. And Terence was a reference to the ancient Roman dramatist, Terence. Oh. And people during the Elizabethan times, we're talking the 16th, 17th centuries, they believed that Terence was actually a front for two aristocratic authors. So, even though he's not openly saying this, he's hinting that Shakespeare was an aristocrat or somebody who was highly ranked. But, again, that wasn't just one reference. There were others like that. And even there was allusions to him being dead in 1607. And the Stratford man, he died in 1616. So that's what I try and do in the book, show you all these references, explain them, and it's a totally different picture.
Well, and it is indeed a totally different picture. I mean, whenever you consider what, at least any American high school student is out there learning about Shakespeare. Any American college student is out there typically learning about Shakespeare. And, like I said in our pre-interview today conversation and our last interview, my wife is a theater major. Most of my friends from college were theater majors. And I sent out questions to them. Like, if you had a question for this author about the controversy of possible Shakespeare authorship. And what one of my friends, a good friend of the podcast and former guest of the podcast, Bryant Mason, amazing Shakespearean actor, actually, brought up an interesting concept. And I'd like to explore it for a second. And that's that, why couldn't he have written it? Why couldn't it have been the man? It's kind of like saying that, like, aliens had to be the ones to build the pyramids. Those things were too big for people to move. That kind of discounts the ingenuity of humanity to an extent. So are we discounting the ingenuity of this common man from Stratford-upon-Avon to possibly have been able to pen these works?
Yes, I mean, I understand ingenuity is universal.
Sure,
it doesn't matter, what class you came from. But if you just strictly look at the plays and analyze them, and you will see that we have expert knowledge, somebody with expert knowledge in many different topics. European geography, French language, Italian language, medicine, the law, plants and flowers, astronomy. There's so many topics in which he incorporated it into his verse seamlessly with the right meaning, everything. He had to have known these topics, and some of these, like rhetoric, some of these topics were not just at your local grammar school, which is what they say. The claim the Stratford man went to the local grammar school, which is possible, although there's no records of it. Those particular records don't exist anymore. But how would he obtain this knowledge of rhetoric if he didn't go to university, which is where it was taught? How would he learn about Italian? How would he learn about astronomy? So it almost is a requirement that he went to university. And, of course, there's no William Shakespeare on the university rolls. But if this was someone's pen name, it would be in a different name, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm saying it's not impossible for somebody to write plays, but the caliber and the level of education is a whole different person that we're talking about. And he had to have taught knowledge at this level. It could not have just come, from just being smart, or the mysteries of genius. That's what professors often say, oh, he was a genius. Well, genius also involves, book learning.
Yeah. And retention of said learning.
Yes.
Not just the fact that you've read a bunch of books.
You had to have been, whoever he was, he had to be an extraordinary person. And we don't have any teachers that have come forth, and say, oh, yes, I tutored him as when he was a child. Or, nobody came up with, oh, here's this child prodigy, he should be given some sort of, grant or scholarship. No such thing ever happened, and yet they had such things.
Yeah,
I think you mentioned Christopher Marlowe. I think he did have some sort of scholarship, but so it's not possible for somebody who did not have a deep education, and the Shakespeare professors claim that he only had barely a grammar school education. In fact, they say that he left early, like, 13 or so, 14, to help his father as a glove maker.
Well, and granted, that is not to say, this is to preface this, folks, that is not to say that the man known as William Shakespeare, the Stratford man, as y'all refer to him at the Shakespeare-Oxford Fellowship, it's not to say that he could not have wordsmithed those words. you know?
Correct.
It's not to say that some kid off the street who has not been brought up with a crazy college education can't write words like Bob Dylan, you know, can't like be an amazing poet laureate. Absolutely they can. But what you're saying is the intimate collegiate type knowledge of the time. And granted, there would be some folk medicine, things like that, as far as herbs, that kind of stuff that, you know, yeah, you may have had a local healer. Hey, maybe even your aunt was the local healer and you had a little bit of knowledge. But whenever you're talking about, like you're saying, the extreme knowledge of the world politic, and the politics of foreign nations, that was not necessarily the knowledge of the common person. There were not circulars going around at the time. Like, sure, you had a town crier, but he wasn't like reading out of the newspaper, you know?
All right, and there were no public libraries. How did he know about the sports and the customs of the nobility, the aristocracy, and how they spoke? And you know, how would he know that unless he had exposure to them? So, I mean, you can say, okay, oh yeah, somebody taught him on the side some Greek, or somebody, you know, someone he knew, a doctor, or, you know, okay, you can, but can you say that for every single topic?
Well, and even in our last episode, when you brought up the concept of the grove of trees in Verona, that is specifically and like prominently mentioned in Romeo and Juliet, like scenes take place there. Prominently mentioned, and that there is actually a grove of those exact trees in that exact location in Verona, Italy, that date back to the time of Romeo and Juliet.
Yes. So that meant he went to Italy, for sure.
Yeah,
and there's another great one in Shakespeare's poem Venus and Adonis, which was very popular. It was printed many times in the 1500s and 1600s. And he mentions, it's just a tiny detail, he mentions the bonnet of Adonis. Adonis is a beautiful young man, teenager, and the goddess Venus falls in love with him. And so it's a story. Their story is a little erotic, you know, which is probably why it was very famous. But there was a painting in Italy by Titian of Venus and Adonis, and it actually went through 5 different versions. And one of the versions shows Adonis with a hunting cap on. The other ones do not. And this is an extremely famous picture in Europe, but it wasn't famous in England. And, you know, there were no depictions of this in England with the man with the hat. So it's, you know, it appears that in other sections of the painting, the poem, it appears that he's describing a painting. And so it very likely was that somebody went to Europe and he had exposure to this painting of Titian. So, you know, these type of coincidences just keep piling up, and it does depict somebody who was a nobleman who took a grand tour of Europe, and a nobleman who had fabulous education, tutoring, went to university, went to law school. That is what got Mark Twain involved in this controversy. He couldn't understand how the Stratford man could get law knowledge like to the depth that he did, without there being any evidence that he attended. And there were law schools there. They called them Inns of Court. So, and even Twain wrote a book called "Is Shakespeare Dead?" just about the authorship question. That was in 1909. So, so it couldn't have been just any person on the street without education. He had to have been somebody.
And granted, this is once again not the realm of crazy science fiction. When we got into this last time, once again, I know what I was taught in theater. I know what I was taught in English. all kinds of stuff. And I'd heard this before, but not until starting to read your book and really delving into this did I start looking at things with a forensic mindset. And I'm no forensic scientist, but when you start thinking about, like, you know, what somebody would be convicted in a court of law on, you know, most of the evidence for the man from Stratford-upon-Avon writing the works of William Shakespeare is purely circumstantial.
Yes, and after he died. And
because, like you said, there are no real works by him out there. It's not like there's another compendium of poetry by him.
No.
Right? No
right.
Original manuscripts exist. You know, like, hopefully my wife someday, I still have all of my original notebooks that I wrote everything down in, and then I transcribe it typically to digital version, you know, so I have a copy. But yeah, all that stuff's sitting in a box, you know. Maybe someday it'll be worth something, who knows, but there's a compendium of my work.
Yes. And that's another narrative that is wrong, false, about that Shakespeare was in it for the money. You know, he wrote for the money. Well, number one, there's no evidence that he was paid as a writer. And number two, what about all the printed plays during his lifetime? There are about 17 different Shakespeare plays that saw print, but their condition is horrible for the most part. They call them the quartos, meaning the size of the page. So there's good quartos and there's bad quartos. Now, if he was in it for the money, why didn't he give him his original manuscript perfected, you know, with no mistakes, to the printers and then, you know, get a cut, right?
Yeah.
No, instead we have for the most part, imperfect to bad editions of the plays. What we're reading today has more than 200 years of editing and guessing of what lines are. If you read the originals, you would have a hard time.
Well, and a prime example of that, and not to get religious, not to do anything like that, there are a couple versions of the Bible out there, like the New Jerusalem Bible, New American Bible, and there's another one off the top of my head that I cannot remember, but there are 3 specific versions of the Bible out there that use the original Aramaic text in the New Testament and the original Hebrew text in the Old Testament. And that is what the translation is derived from, not from Latin, not from Greek. Because otherwise you're adulterating a translation. To take Hebrew, turn it into Latin, and then turn it into English.
You're going to lose something. Yeah.
It's like saying that the language of William Shakespeare is how people spoke. And it's not. The language that they speak in is, you know, like you said earlier, much more a legal type of language, almost the language of law. They like the language of the court,
and very
things like
high
that.
language.
Yeah, it was
not
the vernacular.
Shakespeare invented
as it's called.
2,000 words, maybe more, to the English language. So it's in some cases you wouldn't even have a definition for the word.
Yeah.
So he was playing really to a highly educated audience to begin with. That's my guess.
This brings me to the second point that was brought up by Brian, who, once again, like, if you pulled back Brian's ribs, you would probably find a copy of a Shakespeare work right next to his heart. That's how deep, like, you look at Brian and tell him to go forth with some Shakespeare, and he will just start going with a monologue. Like, he is amazing. And a huge, huge fan. And one of the things that he mentioned was, does it matter? Does it really matter in the long run? If Edward de Vere's wrote this, if you know, Christopher Marlowe wrote it, if the William Shakespeare from Stratford-upon-Avon wrote it? Does it change the words? Does it change what it is? Does it change its impact on the world and society?
Well, I think, number one, it will, because it's going to, if you have an actual biography, which we don't really have, we don't have a literary biography. Yeah. If we have a real biography, if you read it, and then you read a Shakespeare play, you're going to see some parallels, right? Sure. And right now there are zero parallels. How could you expect to read 40 or so Shakespeare plays and not see any life parallels? I mean, what novelist writes a novel without inserting, some of his own life experiences or themes, and how are you going to understand the author's motivation if we have the real author? Also, like we were talking about the printed editions, we don't have the originals. I don't think the world has even read the real Shakespeare plays. They're sitting somewhere. If we know who the real author is, maybe we can start looking in the right direction and find them, discover where they could be. The author's originals. Those are just a few. Also, there's just the simple justice.
Yeah.
I mean, if you wrote Romeo and Juliet, wouldn't you want to get credit? So
one would think so, but at the same time, technically the author wasn't if it was Edward de Vere's, he wasn't seeking credit. Otherwise, he wouldn't have put it under a pen name, right?
He wasn't seeking credit during his lifetime. That's the difference. Yeah. After death, he should have gotten his due. And that's that is the mystery. That is the real mystery of why he didn't.
That's kind of what I retorted back as well. I was like, I think it's really more about the institutionalization of knowledge and the fact of, because this is what it is and what it's been taught, it now can't be wronged.
Right. It's like a truth now. And anyone who tries to say, hey, there's something wrong here, they batten them down. It's terrible. Prime
example, I am a fourth-degree Knight of Columbus. One of my favorite things to do while I'm having a beer with my fellow knights is to, Columbus never actually came here, right?
Yeah, with the Bahamas, or
but even then, that wasn't a territory of the United States until when? That's like saying whoever found the Philippines found America, or whoever found Guam.
Right. It's true.
Or Hawaii.
Yeah.
No, we're talking mainland America. He didn't come here, and he wasn't trying to find the place. He was using somebody else's map. And who did he run into when he got there? Because the place wasn't empty.
That's right.
So he didn't find anything. He ran across it, but he didn't find anything.
Right.
So, yeah, there's a different scope to history whenever you start looking at things like that. And it's important. It's important to keep that mindset, and it's important to say, we need to correct that. We can no longer just keep that up as a rote form of history when it is not correct history. It's not.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
It's not. So that means that we shouldn't teach it that way. So if it's the fact that maybe William Shakespeare wrote this stuff, even if it's the fact that you get down to the point of at least putting to point the question and making the question a valid one, like questions are in science.
Yes.
Whenever you
That's
go
why,
into... go ahead.
If you go to doubtaboutwill.org, you can read the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt about the Stratford man. Just you read it. It's very logical. We believe there's reason to doubt him as the author, and over 4,000 people have signed it. Many of them with high degrees, academic degrees, and you can see who they are. Some famous people too.
Yeah.
And there is reason to doubt, and we should include that in our classes so people have the full information. That's pretty much the reason why I'm so into this.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's kind of literally the job of a professor. It's literally the job of the teacher is not only to teach something, but to teach the exploration of the topic.
Right.
And even if to doubt the topic, even for somebody in the conversation to play Doubting Thomas and say, what if, is important. I think it's an important part of the conversation.
The bastion of the, Stratfordianism, they just don't want to hear about it.
Yeah.
So they were even offered a 40,000-pound donation. And they rejected it, the donation being to, prove their case for the Stratford man.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to accept it.
Well,
so doesn't that kind of raise a question right there, that they're not confident?
Yeah, exactly. And now, one of the questions that my wife had, because, my wife and I are huge fans of the show Curse of Oak Island. And I mentioned in the last episode that one of the things supposedly buried in the treasure vault in Oak Island is lost works of William Shakespeare. So they've had people on the show talking about how these works are by Francis Bacon, things like that, all kinds of stuff. Now, granted, this has been a treasure hunting theory for hundreds of years. Since the 1700s, people like Franklin Roosevelt put money into the search for the treasure on Oak Island. Like tons of famous people. But what's wild is to see that how these guys chasing a literal myth have been finding actual history that is quite literally changing the history and the face of history in North America. To see the fact that, they are finding structures where it's like, here's a road going down the road with a turn in it. It's not like a random scattering of rocks. This thing has a turn in it. And it dates back to the 1400s.
Wow.
There's no record of people being in that area in the 1400s on that island.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Anything like that. Now, there are Micmacs and, local Indians and indigenous people, but not the fact of, hey, here's a civilization on the island that built a road. So even if you're chasing the myth, you can uncover history.
Right, and people keep uncovering new things all the time, and then the same with Shakespeare. So, if you find evidence that it really was somebody else, it should be considered. And, with reason, not with, ad hominem attacks, which is what they usually do. So that's what really motivated me, actually, to write Shakespeare Suppressed, is there was a prominent English professor who was on C-SPAN, and people around the country were asking him questions, and someone brought up the authorship question, and he immediately dismissed it. And he said, some people think Queen Elizabeth wrote the works. He just discounted it. And I thought to myself, gee, I went to university, I have an education, and I see there is something wrong here, why are you insulting me? In essence, is what I thought to myself. So I thought, okay, I'm going to look at the Stratford man's case deeper and see what makes him so confident. And that's what kind of led to my journey on writing the book. And my book kept growing and growing and growing. And so it took me 7 years to finish. But, we should all take in new evidence and see where it takes us.
Well, and be willing to. That's half of what this show is about, is being willing to have conversations that you might not normally be willing to. Being willing to listen to somebody else's side without judging it or judging why they believe it. And
just to have a civil conversation.
Sure.
Without throwing names at each other.
Oh, absolutely.
And in the end, you learn from each other.
What's scary is I know some people that probably start throwing names at each other over this topic. I could see it. I could see it after about the third glass of scotch, just a tumbler going flying across the room at me. But let's get one of the concepts that my wife was talking about whenever we were discussing this yesterday was Christopher Marlowe. Because he was a contemporary. Correct?
Yeah.
There is. So let's talk a little bit about him and the theory of that real quick, because that's another one. Francis Bacon is out there, and then we'll get into Edward de Vere after that.
Sure. Christopher Marlowe, he was a famous playwright in his day. He didn't live very long. He was murdered, actually. I think he was like 32 or 33. He was fairly
Yep.
Up until that point, he had written about 7 plays or so. So I guess what you would have to believe is that he was not murdered, and that he fled to Europe. I'm sorry, I don't know what really the reason would be, but he went to Europe and he wrote plays there. I just find it unlikely, because we do have, I think, a forensic report or something that was done, an inquiry in his death. So it really appears that he died. And how did he have time to write, all those plays?
Yeah.
I mean, he only wrote 7 while he was in England, and so he wrote another 33 or so abroad, and somehow they ended up back in England. I haven't studied his case, honestly, but I do know his 7 plays, and they're really not, in my opinion, they don't have the same voice as the Shakespeare plays. They're a little bit kind of bombastic style. But they were enormously popular, and I'm not putting him down. But I don't see it. He had good education. He went to university, so I mean, there's pluses there. But I tend to believe that he was murdered, as it said.
Yeah.
As far as Bacon goes, he was the darling of the early anti-Stratfordians. When this movement really kind of started in the 1850s, he was very prominent as being the true author. And it rightly so, because he did have an incredible education, and especially in the sciences, and the law. So, and he was involved. He was a courtier. He knew important people. I believe his uncle was Lord Burleigh, who pretty much ran the country, or he was a relation.
Well, Francis Bacon himself was Lord Chancellor.
Oh, that was later.
Yeah.
Yes, he became Lord Chancellor. So, I mean, he has all the right elements as far as education and experience. I believe he also went abroad, too. But, he wrote a huge body of mainly scientific works and philosophical works. It's kind of hard to believe that he would write 2 enormous works, one being scientific, the other being literary. Also, he was not known as a playwright. He wrote, supposedly, One Mask, which is like a play, but that's all we know about. And and also, if you look at the sonnets, the Shakespeare sonnets, which are very personal, and you look at the plays, you don't really see life experiences that are parallel, like you would with my candidate, who was the Earl of Oxford. So that's kind of my answers to those 2 candidates.
Well, and speaking of the good Earl of Oxford, let's polish this up with a little bit of Edward de Vere and why what we know as the works of Shakespeare, you really think are pointing his direction.
Yes. Well, again, if you look at what the works are, the knowledge contained in the works, every single topic can be accounted for in the Earl of Oxford's education and life experiences. So that is without question. He was a great patron of the arts. He over 28 books were dedicated to him, books on medicine, history, translations, poetry. His secretaries were dramatists. His personal secretaries, John Lilly and Anthony Mundy. One of the books, he was among several people who were given a dedication poem in Edwin Spenser's Faerie Queen. He's a very famous writer of the period. So he knew Oxford. He had a reputation as an excellent poet and playwright, and yet none of his plays have survived under his name. It was also reported that he wrote anonymously. So again, that's kind of pointing toward either not putting your name or putting a false name. He was deeply involved in the theater. He owned 2 acting companies. He held the lease on a theater. So all of that is, in his favor right there. He was also, if you want to, look at life experiences, the life of Hamlet very much reflects his life. He was a university student. He was a nobleman. He was a courtier. He was a traveler. He killed somebody. The Earl of Oxford killed somebody when he was a teenager. All of that is applicable to the Earl of Oxford. Even he patronized an acting company. Hamlet did, right? Just so did the Earl of Oxford. And a very exceptional one, which I probably mentioned before, he was on a ship that was attacked by pirates, and he lost everything. That's Hamlet, right? The same was for the Earl of Oxford. So, that's just one of many life parallels. For example, in All's Well That Ends Well, it opens with Bertram. It's being told that Bertram was a ward of the court because his father had died. And so, therefore, he had to live at the court, and also his marriage was going to be controlled by the king. Well, the same thing happened to the Earl of Oxford. His father died when he was 12. He became a ward of Queen Elizabeth, and she controlled his marriage. She encouraged, or, probably forced his marriage to the daughter of Lord Burleigh, who was the prime minister of the country, So there's a parallel right there. And there's many others.
And not only that, but I've got his history from Encyclopedia Britannica pulled up right now. William Cecil was the original name of Lord Burleigh. Along the way, he started with Arthur Golding, who translated Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Yes.
So he definitely had contact and connection with publishers.
Yes, and they say that Ovid's Metamorphoses, translated by Arthur Golding, who was Oxford's uncle, they all say that greatly influenced William Shakespeare, whoever he was.
Wow.
So here he was, Arthur Golding, in the same house with the Earl of Oxford, which the house was Lord Burleigh's house, William Cecil, his house. So it's probably he was there to tutor him. But at the same time, he's writing Ovid's, a translation for Ovid's Metamorphoses. And many of Oxfordians believe that Oxford wrote some of those passages, in Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Interesting.
But a little bit.
And that's something to be stated, especially whenever you're looking at history. I'm putting up my air quotes right now. I know you're on the phone, Catherine, but just for all our radio listeners out there, in air quotes, history. Never forget, history is written by the victors. And one of my favorite works of literature, Beowulf, love it, amazing work, really wild, epic poem. But known is the fact that what we are reading is more than likely nowhere near the original text of Beowulf. We have no copy of the original text of Beowulf, and the only thing that we have, because it was a Viking story, the only thing that we have was taken down by Christian monks and translated and translated and translated. So they took this story, put it into text, and the people who translated it were people of a totally different faith, totally different religion, totally different background. So do you think that they got it all right? once again, whenever you're translating a book or it's pretty easy whenever you're translating something to throw a little bit of something extra in there, especially if most of the people can't even read the translation that you're putting in, much less the text you're translating.
Right.
So,
I would encourage people to read Arthur Golding's translation. It has that Shakespearean feel. I think that the Earl of Oxford really did contribute to it. And also later in life, the Earl of Oxford, this is again a point in his favor, he was given £1,000 grant per year for no stated reason. And the Queen was notoriously stingy. She never gave out money. And £1,000 was close to $1 million today.
Wow.
So he was really giving him a lot of money. And you wonder, okay, well, what was it for? Well, we don't know. But one of my guesses is that he had been supplying her with entertainment for decades, a couple decades before that. And it was very expensive to put on a production before Queen Elizabeth. So he may have been paying for all that, and perhaps she was at this point compensating for him. Also, when he received the grant, that was in 1586, it was a couple years before the Spanish Armada invasion. It was 1588. So she could have been also asking him, use the money to write plays and produce them to incite patriotism among the people. Plays like Henry V, for example.
Oh,
so,
interesting.
there could have been a propaganda arm attached. And why didn't Queen Elizabeth have any encounters with William Shakespeare, quote unquote? We don't have anything, and yet we have her encounters with other writers of the period. Why not the greatest one of all? And in fact, it's on the title pages of some Shakespeare plays that she actually saw Merry Wives of Windsor. She actually saw Love's Labour's Lost. This is on the title pages of plays. So isn't there a connection? Well, maybe there was, but not under the name William Shakespeare.
Yeah. And once again, we have to be willing to look at this evidence with open hearts, open eyes, and not necessarily toss out what we know about William Shakespeare, but add it to the recipe and see what rises, That's another reason why we should have the right man, why it matters, because we don't right now, we don't even know when any of the plays were written. It's all a question mark. And that when I read my first Shakespeare play, which was Hamlet, I was looking inside, and they gave a list of all the plays, and next to them was like 1592 question mark, 1602 question mark. Everything had a question mark, and this is before I knew anything about the authorship question. I just thought it was odd that after several hundred years of scholarship, they still don't know when Hamlet was written. Why is that the case? Because they don't have a biography to match it with. So you have zero biography. You're not going to know when these works were written. But if you look at the evidence, you have a real biography, then you can sort it. Like, for example, there is evidence that Queen Elizabeth saw in 1577. Stratford Man was like 13 or 14. 1577, she saw a play called The History of Error. So could this not have been the Comedy of Errors? Well, if it was a play that was performed in 1596 instead of 1577, they would say, yeah, it was. But because the Stratford Man was so young, a teenager, it's impossible, right? So, they have to discount this as evidence. You see, that's because we have the wrong biography. So in many ways, it matters to have the right biography. Yeah. Well, it mainly because, much like in interpreting anything in the Bible, we are not there. We do not know the author. The words that are written there are more than likely not they are more than likely a retelling of what somebody else was saying. Very few of them we know the actual penned person who wrote them, you know?
Exactly.
So
they probably bootlegged the plays by having stenographers in the audience while they're being played and writing them out. That's why they're so incorrect.
Well, and, whenever you're looking at that, like you're saying, having that biography is so important because that, much like interpreting anything from the Bible, you have to know when it was written, the culture it was written for, what was happening with them historically at the time. It's all important to the translation and what those words actively mean, especially what they mean in a modern day society, in a modern day context. But when you're trying to bring them down to why these words were written to begin with, which hopefully any forensic document examiner or people that do that kind of work in the realm of literature and world literature, hopefully that is what they are exploring with the concept of.
And how about this with the Earl of Oxford? When he died in 1604, it was June of 1604, in Christmas time of that year, 6 Shakespeare plays were performed at the royal court, and previously they hadn't been. So it kind of makes you wonder, was this a tribute to the Earl of Oxford? And then a few years later, when Oxford's wife died, there were several more Shakespeare plays performed. So is it a coincidence, or was this a tribute, a royal tribute?
Yeah.
Actually, the second edition of Hamlet, which was the more fuller copy of Hamlet, this was in 1604-05, right around there. It had the royal coat of arms on the opening page, not the title page, the opening text page. So again, seems to have been a royal, dictate to have that printed. So it's just all, it lends itself to the Earl of Oxford as a true author. I don't in no way want to put down the Stratford man.
No.
He was involved, but not as a writer. He was used really as a red herring. They used him to totally disconnect the Earl of Oxford with the works. And I would say it had to do with various representations of Lord Burleigh, who we've mentioned, who was his father-in-law. They weren't flattering portrayals. Also, his brother-in-law, Robert Cecil, he was not. Some people think he was represented as Richard III, the Hunchback, and Robert Cecil had a sway back. It was political, in my opinion, and ultimately it was Shakespeare's sonnets that really created the need, in my opinion, for a disconnect between Oxford and Shakespeare, because they are so personal, and because they are so also, if you read them a certain way, can be political. He seems to describe the young man, the beautiful young man in the sonnets, as a prince, theoretically the child of Queen Elizabeth. Now, I don't want to, I know that may sound a little, off target, but if you look at the evidence, the great author believed this, it appears. So we have to go with what he thought was true. So that wouldn't bode well for a succession for King James I, right? So
sure.
If it was known there was a royal child alive, which was described by the aristocrat Earl of Oxford, it was better to say, hey, they were written by somebody who was not connected to the court, would not know about any princely child, and therefore it takes away this idea of somebody else succeeding the throne. I don't know if that made sense, but I think that was a major motivation for the disconnect.
And that's interesting. Even to bring up the point of, a pen name, and why a pen name. why never get credit for, and granted, nobody ever, it's pretty rare that an author, especially an author putting out such work, and such a volume of work so rapidly, doesn't want credit for their work,
Well, like I said, in his lifetime, the Earl of Oxford, being a nobleman, would not have wanted notice while he was alive, because it was considered déclassé, and he was the 17th Earl. He has had a very proud family, 400 years of history, his family at that point. Nobody had that.
Wow.
So he wanted to protect his name. He didn't want to, everyone to know that he was associating with actors and writing plays, and eventually went on the public stage. So after he died, however, he should have gotten credit. You see, and that's really the key. Why didn't he get credit? Other, people with aristocratic connections, like Sir Philip Sidney, when he died, a few years later, his own sister published some of his works, and he was a courtier. But they were not published in his lifetime. He was following the social code at the time.
Well, and as we said in the last episode, there really was that social code of, if you were a courtier, if you were somebody in the royal court, okay, great. Maybe you entreat somebody to a poem around some sherry at the fireside one evening, something like that, when we're all swapping the muse. But you don't tell everybody that you sit and while away your hours writing plays and writing all that stuff.
Right. That wasn't the proper vocation or a vocation for somebody like
nobleman,
that.
For a nobleman.
He should have been like a military commander or
and once again,
minister of some sort.
Francis Bacon, and it's not that the Earl of Oxford hadn't published, right?
No, he did not. He did not in his lifetime. In fact, I argue in my book, one chapter, that he was trying to prevent people from publishing his works, and actually it is written where somebody said that when The Passionate Pilgrim was printed in 1599, the great author was very upset about it. This was written years later by.
Wow.
Someone named Haywood. Why would he be upset about that if he was, somebody who's just trying to make a living? He would be happy. He would want the profits.
Yeah,
right?
I'd want more of them out there.
Exactly. He would give them all sorts of manuscripts to print. So, yeah, the whole profile that emerges is not somebody who was trying to write for money, but for his own muse and also for the entertainment of the Queen and of her court. But, then politics got involved somehow, and people at the top arranged this red herring of the Stratford man, and that occurred in 1623 in the first, they call it the First Folio, which is really just a collection of Shakespeare plays. And in the opening pages, they made reference to Stratford Monument, and on another page to Avon, and you put those together, Stratford upon Avon, and the world hasn't looked back ever since. They assumed he was somebody from Stratford on Avon.
Now, with that in mind, before we let you go, what apple carts does this overturn? Why not explore it? As a final point, why not explore these options? Why do the halls of academia, are they purposefully trying to quash this? What's the purpose?
They do recognize there are problems with the biography, but they don't talk about it. They don't openly talk about it. They talk about it in their private, they're not private, but their journals. They discuss that there is problems with biography, but they don't discuss it to the general public. They're entrenched in it. If it were proven that the great author were someone else, it would invalidate a lot of their works, what you've built your reputation on, what your PhD upon. So that would upset the apple cart for sure. And also the town of Stratford-on-Avon, gets, millions in tourism, or it has up until recently. And, they just seem to want to preserve this in my opinion, myth of the Stratford man. If you don't have lifetime evidence for the Stratford man as the great author, you should not promote this. You should investigate it and get to the bottom of it, and we can start getting real analysis, academic analysis, based on the life story of the real author. And I think that's basically it. Or they're just too entrenched. And, when you go to read a Shakespeare play with a professor, they pretty much don't go into the history of the man. They go into criticism. It's more literary criticism than history. So, those just are a few reasons, I would say. But I'm not an academic, so I can't say 100%. I know. I'm just figuring it out and what other people have said.
Well, and to me, it's one of those points of, to what point academic and academia, you've spent no less the amount of time researching this, researching the other book, doing all the research that you have done for the websites, for Shakespeare-Oxford Fellowship, for the doubtaboutwill.org. By that point, you've done enough for a master's degree. You have done enough for a PhD.
I think so. I think I have. In my mind, it doesn't matter if I have one or not.
No,
the evidence is evidence.
No. And I would be interested because, a PhD is one of those, you can always propose something, quote, philosophical. You could always propose something that isn't actually existent. As long as you can defend the thesis.
Right.
That's the idea. So it would be interesting for somebody to make this their thesis.
Yes.
And bring it, and I put that challenge out there for any of you open-minded theater folk, for any of you open-minded English majors out there, putting forth the comparison contrast between these known things from Edward de Vere and William Shakespeare, between the history and the knowledge of somebody of the royal court and somebody who was just an average Joe from Stratford-upon-Avon.
I would tell English majors, read the Encyclopedia Britannica version of the Earl of Oxford's life. It's not very long, and then read a Shakespeare play and see if you notice some parallels. See if it makes sense to you.
Yeah.
If it makes it easier for you.
There's a reason why I bring up encyclopedias on screen, Catherine, and it is because, as a kid, I had encyclopedias and I read them all. I couldn't stand a whole lot of stuff, but I could stand a little bit of everything.
Yes.
So it was great to get the synopsis of something in 2 or 3 pages,
right.
And it really is whenever you start, I had all of that up on screen earlier. And whenever you start looking at it and comparing and contrasting it and having an open mind, and once again, looking at it not necessarily as a forensic scientist, but with a forensic mindset of does this match up? If somebody came to you, if your kid came home on a Saturday night at 2 a.m. and his curfew was 10 and this was his story, would you buy it? Would you let him, would you be okay, well, I can understand why you didn't call then, son? Or would you be something just doesn't seem right?
Right.
Yeah. And when you look at this stuff with the thread of common sense and through the lens of history and through the lens of the biography of what people lived, once again, I'm not saying it is Edward de Vere's. I'm saying it matches up a whole lot more than your average Joe.
Yes, and if you read the Shakespeare sonnets, I would say read sonnet 81, where he's talking to the fair youth, and he says, "From hence your memory death cannot take, although in me each part will be forgotten. Your name from hence immortal life shall have, though I once gone, to all the world must die." So remember that.
Yeah.
he wasn't happy. He seemed to know that his name would not be connected to the Shakespeare works.
Yeah.
It's also a sad story. Yeah.
And the ending of it is interesting as well. When all the breathers of this world are dead, you shall still live. Such virtue hath my pen.
Hath my pen, yes.
Where breathe most breaths, even in the mouths of men.
Yes, even in the eyes of men. Yes.
So, yeah, very, very interesting words and kind of cryptic of the fact of, kind of, don't worry about it. You'll be remembered.
Yes, but he will not, you see.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Really, really interesting.
And it doesn't make sense because why wouldn't? His name is William Shakespeare. Why wouldn't his name live? Well, it's not his real name. It's his pen name, you see.
Yeah.
The fair youth's name will live because the fair youth, I think everyone knew during those times, was the Earl of Southampton. And the Earl of Southampton was the dedicatee of Shakespeare's poem Venus and Adonis. So here you have the connection between the Earl of Southampton and Shakespeare. His name will live forever because it's associated with the Shakespeare work.
Wow.
But his name will not live forever, meaning Shakespeare, because his real name is not on the work.
Wow.
So he's lamenting this in the sonnets, I believe.
Interesting interpretation of that. Once again, Katherine, thank you so much for the time. It is
it's so fun.
Amazing talking with you. And this, once again, my fingertips are tingling after our episode because my brain just starts going and things start happening, and I get all antsy and excited inside. So I can't wait until our next time that you come on and talk about all this stuff.
It would be my pleasure. Thank you. And for giving this second opportunity is really very generous. Thank you.
Most definitely. Absolutely. And anytime, next time you have a convention, anything like that coming up, please do let us know. We'll share that on social media, all that kind of stuff. That is what we are all about.
Thank you so much.
Before we go, please do one last chance for shameless self-promotion, Katherine. Let everybody know the websites, where they can go to sign the petition, all that good stuff.
Yeah, we'll sign the petition at doubtaboutwill.org. And you can also see who else has signed the petition, some very famous people. And go to Shakespeare-Oxford Fellowship.org. And also my website is Shakespeare-Suppressed.com, and you can buy through the website. Also, you can buy through Amazon. It's listed on Amazon. And also there's a good show called Don't Quill the Messenger, which is the outreach program for the Shakespeare-Oxford Fellowship. A lot of good speakers there on the topic.
Great. Fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for the time. Please do hold the line while we close this show out. While you are online checking out all the great work of the Shakespeare-Oxford Fellowship, doubtaboutwill.org. Go sign that petition. I'm on the petition. Tons of people are on the petition. It's amazing. You get to see the whole list. While you're online checking all that out, please do make sure to stop on by our sponsor websites, truehymnscience.com, as well as podcastcadet.com. Stop on by the Dudes and Beer website, get the app. Check out the Knowledge Vault. We're going to be having some great documents come into there here soon. Check out the store. That's where you can buy your copy of Shakespeare Suppressed. Until next time, everybody, I've been Chris Jordan. This has been Dudes and Beer. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And remember, if you can't be good at it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Dudes and Beer podcast. To listen to our audio streams or chat with us live, download the official Dudes and Beer app for Android and iDevices, available on Google Play and iTunes markets. For more episodes, content, and information, visit us online at dudesandbeer.com. You can also find our episodes on Breach.tv, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast service. Dudes and Beer is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. For more about our sponsors and other podcasts on this network, visit hcuniversalnetwork.com. Thanks for listening, everybody, and until next time, drink responsibly.